our next speaker, Dr. Simon Kolstoe. Simon has been involved in matters of research integrity, governance and ethics for many years. He recently joined the Board of Trustees at UKRIO as ZO. I'm very lucky to have him with us today to share his perspectives. Simon, thank you very much. The virtual floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, James. One thing I will say, I've had a slightly ropey internet connection this morning, so I do apologise if it sort of stutters a little bit. I'll try to speak slowly, so hopefully if it does freeze for a moment, you won't miss too much. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about some of the complexities I think we find in this area. And in fact, it's really nice being able to go after Zoe, because I think I can touch on a number of things that she raised, and our talks, I think, very much complementary there. For my sort of introductory slide here, sort of a few of my conflicts of interest or certainly other interests. And I actually spend most of my time chairing ethics committees for the Health Research Authority, Ministry of Defence, UK Health Security Agency, and indeed am involved with ethics with the European Commission as well. However, my background wasn't really in ethics originally. In fact, I was a biochemist, and due to various accidents of luck, so to speak, one of the drug compounds we were working on got to the point of going to clinical trials. And at that point, I came across ethics committees, governance, and all these processes for the first time. And I think both myself and other members of our lab very much felt like this tiger here, being forced to jump through burning hoops to have all these requirements before we could get going with our research. And so I kind of got into this area almost as frustration from a researcher's perspective, saying, you know, there's so many processes, so many governance processes, ethics processes that you have to go through as a researcher. It really stops research and in some ways can cause quite a lot of problems for research. And surely there must be better ways of doing this sort of thing. So over the last 10, 15 years or so, research has moved away from the sort of biochemistry drug development into looking at ethics and governance processes, expanding into considering things like research culture and integrity as well. And I'm now a reader in bioethics at the University of Portsmouth, and recently became a trustee of UKRIO. And so I think this is a really fascinating area, because I think it's a very important area within research, but I think we do have to acknowledge that it's also an area that can cause significant frustration for researchers, both in terms of having to deal with governance, but also as we see sort of inequalities and inequities within the research process. Now, I'm not the only person or the only researcher to have become frustrated with this in this area. This was a paper published a couple years ago by some researchers at the University of Cambridge, and they actually sat down and catalogued all the emails and all the people they had to interact with just to get a single research project off the ground. And in fact, there's a researcher in my institution who's done something similar and came up with a very similar result of the sorts of hundreds of emails. And any of you here who are researchers will know this sort of, you spend far more of your time dealing with administrative type processes than you do actually doing research sometimes. And if you sit down and sort of start to try and catalogue some of these things, you know, there's interactions with funders, with sort of contractual things, and you have to consider your research design and methodologies you need to use. And then depending on your design and your methodologies, there's various permissions that you know to go and seek. And then there's this horrible area of data protection governance, sort of GDPR, these four initials that everyone certainly in the UK and Europe are terrified about. How do you get those sorts of issues right? Then you sort of touch on these things around general research conduct, the sorts of things Zoe was talking about, research integrity. And this whole landscape, I think, can sometimes feel really quite overwhelming to the researcher. And unfortunately, what often generally tends to happen is people sort of use a shortcut of this and say, oh, well, you know, we have to get through ethics before we have to do our research. And a lot of this sort of stuff gets sort of bundled together in a sort of ethics and governance picture. And I think that can actually be really quite confusing, because I think in many ways, a lot of researchers and a lot of people just within the research environment don't actually have a really clear idea of all the parts of the system and how they actually interact with each other. And I think sometimes that some of the problems that we encounter as researchers comes from not having a particularly clear understanding of the landscape which we find ourselves in. Now, this is something that I think lots of people appreciate. And the problem is, one of the actions that lots of people take is to then go and sort of study this and write reports. And certainly if you've sort of been aware of the sort of integrity type area, you'll know that there's all sorts of reports that have been written by people like the Wellcome Trust, Nuffield Council. Vita is sort of looking at research culture, looking at integrity, looking at the sort of governance processes that sort of sit alongside our actions as researcher. And we've already had, as Zoe referred to, the work that the Royal Society has done. In the United Kingdom, we have the Select Committee, the House of Commons Science Technology Select Committee have done a number of reports and investigations into this sort of area of research integrity. And then we have sort of global organizations like the World Conference on Research Integrity that Zoe was talking to, and Retraction Watch, which is one of my favorite websites that sort of goes through all the reasons why papers have been retracted. It's kind of like the gossip column, I think, for researchers. We've heard reference to Marcus Manafo and the UK Reproducibility Network, the UKRIO, and then just recently in the UK, we've had this new committee, UKRIO, the Committee on Research Integrity. This has been set up. So I think there's a sort of wealth of information out there. There's a lot of organizations. There's an awful lot of reports. And I think that sometimes leave researchers particularly sort of feeling a little bit disempowered. It's such a complex environment. How exactly do we make a start in addressing some of these issues in a really practical way? And so my approach to this is I sort of came across this all out of just frustration and trying to get my head around the landscape. But I think one of the things that really struck home to me was a paper, and the first there was a series of papers published by Ian Chalmers and Paul Glazou starting in about 2009, looking specifically at the area of research waste. And I think this was the thing that sort of really struck a chord with me in this entire area. And they came up with this fantastic figure that 85% of research is wasted because it asked the wrong questions, is badly designed, not published, or poorly reported. And now I certainly got into research, and in my case, medical research, because I thought it was something that could sort of really help and benefit other people. And thus it's absolutely shocking to see a figure like this, 85% of research is wasted. And especially if you consider the amount of the time we spend as researchers lobbying for funding or trying to see why our research is fantastic and groundbreaking, is going to make a big difference to the world. And yet you have this sort of horrible figure of 85%. And a lot of people didn't believe this. And Ian and Paul are not two people to be trifled with. And I think over a period of about 15 or so years, they've kept publishing papers arguing why this is a number. And essentially their calculation goes along the lines of this, is that out of every 100 projects that get funded, there's really solid evidence to show that only about half of those projects lead to some sort of publication or some sort of outcome at the end of the project. And if you take those 50 publications, if you look at them, only about half of those publications are good enough to actually reproduce the experiment. This is where it sort of touches on some of the reproducibility aspects. And that's a number that I absolutely agree with, having been a postdoc, taking the methods section of a paper into the lab and trying to replicate an experiment and realizing there's sort of some key issues, key elements of the experiment missing. I absolutely believe that number. And of about those half that you can actually reproduce in the lab, or can at least make an attempt to do again, only about half of those have no serious or avoidable design flaws. So, that you can actually get the same result that the original people were doing, or that there's sort of good argument or good logic in the paper. And this is how they came up with this basically 85% of research waste. And I think this has actually been quite robust. And whenever anyone's tried to argue this number, this calculation, there's lots of evidence to show this. Now, they went on, worked with a lot of different people, and there was a series of 5 papers published in The Lancet a few years later, sort of trying to really drill into these issues of research waste, and came out with this sort of quite helpful table identifying sort of 5 specific areas. So looking at how research questions are come up with in the first place, looking at how research methods are chosen to answer those questions, looking at this issue around efficient research regulation and management that I touched on briefly before, and then ensuring that once you've done the research that the information is fully accessible, unbiased, and published. And so I think that's all very helpful. And in fact, I went to a talk again at World Conference of Research Integrity. This was the one in Amsterdam in 2017, and heard Ian Chalmers talk about this. And he was specifically focusing on ethics and governance processes and how they could be a main form of research waste. And I got to talking to him after the conference, and we got to sort of considering this sort of table and this sort of understanding of research waste, and saying, well, although efficient research regulation and management is sort of held up as being potentially a problem in this area. Surely in an ideal world, what we could actually do is, if you made those sorts of processes better, what they could actually do is have a positive effect on some of these other aspects of research waste. And so through various conversations over the last couple of years, and then in a couple of papers that we've published, and I know Zoe was involved actually in one of the pieces of work we did around this. What we've been doing is looking at ethics and governance processes and saying, well, can we construct these in such a way that rather than contributing to research waste and contributing to problems in this area, they can actually have a really positive effect. So we published this paper, and I want to just sort of briefly run through some of the thinking that we've got, and some, I think, practical ways that, whether or not you're a researcher in a university or you're working research administration or other aspects of the research process, some sort of really practical ways that you can think about this whole area and apply some sort of processes and some thinking that will help address some of the problems, especially that Zoe was introducing in the first talk this morning. And I think one of the sort of key elements is trying to get a bit of an understanding as to the landscape, and this sort of complex landscape where people use, some people talk about research integrity, other people talk about reproducibility, other people talk about research culture, other people talk about research waste. And there's a sort of question, are these all the same things? How do they relate to each other? So I think getting some good definitions is a good place to start. When I read this paper, and this was the one I referred to a moment ago about research approvals iceberg, and about all the numbers of people you had to interact with to get a research project off the ground, one of the things that struck me is that there was quite a lot of conflation between different processes that were the responsibility of different parts of the system. And myself and David Carpenter, who some of you may have come across through ARMA and UKRIO previously, wrote a response to the paper saying that it's really important to get a really clear understanding of who's responsible for what within the research landscape. And the model that we sort of been thinking about and come up with over the last couple of years is that, in this case, I'm talking about research culture. When I'm sort of considering what a good research culture looks like if we want to address some of these problems and some of these issues that Zoe introduced in the first talk, is that it's helpful to consider sort of three specific perspectives or approaches you can take to ensuring you have a research culture. And for the purposes of this model, I've referred to them as governance, integrity, and ethics. And I want to just briefly go through and explain what I mean by these. So when we talk about research integrity, Zoe was talking about, and Zoe was referring to the virtues and the ways that researchers act. And I very much agree with that. And if you look at the sorts of virtues of a researcher, the sorts of personal characteristics that researchers come up with, there's been various studies. And one of the early ones actually was this Nuffield Council one. And what they essentially did is they went around, spoke to lots of researchers, lots of people within research environments, said, well, what are the key characteristics of a good researcher? And they came up with a list of about 10 or so. I know there's been a number of papers and other reports recently that sort of looked at the sort of key virtues of a researcher. But just sort of as an example, if you take these four, a good researcher is rigorous, original, honest, and open. These are sort of the character traits that we'd like to build within our researchers and within our research community. And looking at these, I mean, pretty much I imagine everyone would agree with this, but you can go a little bit further than just saying, yes, these are good things, is by considering this in the perspective of Aristotelian virtue theory, which is a sort of philosophical approach to ethics and trying to understand how people actually behave. The idea of a virtue is it sits on the golden mean between two vices, a vice of deficiency where you don't have enough of that virtue, and a vice of excess where there might be too much of that. And what you can do is by doing this sort of analysis on the virtues, you can start to see the behaviors on both sides of the spectrum that you'd like to try to avoid within research. And for all the virtues, and including the other ones that Zoe mentioned, you can sort of sit down and try to understand, well, what does it look like when people don't have enough of this virtue? What sort of behaviors does that lead to? Or conversely, if there's, people go too far in some of these areas. And then you can think, well, how is it that we can go about promoting these virtues? And something that I've definitely learned through leading various research integrity courses and training sessions at numerous institutions and organizations is that it's very difficult for someone outside a research field or outside a research community to lecture researchers on these areas. These are issues that very much need to come from the academic communities themselves. And this, I think, one of the key roles that mentoring has is that people learn how to behave by copying others, essentially. If you're a parent and you have children, your children learn to behave by copying you. And I think we see that very much within research communities, that as people work with more senior researchers, work within research environments, they start to adopt the behaviors that the other people they are working with have as well. So I think when we're talking about research integrity in this context and these research virtues, this is very much something we need to encourage our research communities to be thinking about and talking about with their junior researchers and with the people that they are mentoring. And I think this puts a very sort of specific responsibility on who it is within the research environment to culture these sorts of behaviours. I think it very much lies within the academic communities. Now, this, I think, is very different to another approach to this that one can take that we've called governance in this particular circle. And I think along with people knowing how to behave and behaving in virtuous ways, the fact is that we work in a society and there's various policies, processes and laws that we have to obey if we are going to be conducting any behaviours, but especially research. So if you're doing medical research, and especially clinical research, we have things like the Clinical Trials Regulations, Mental Capacity Act, Human Tissue Act, those sorts of laws that we have to follow. And there's going to be lots of other policies as well. Your institutions will have policies, professional bodies, British Psychological Society, there's all sorts of policies to follow as well. And indeed, UKRIO has produced some very helpful checklists as a sort of responsibilities and duties that researchers have as well. And this, I think, is a slightly different approach to the sort of virtue approach I was talking about within integrity. I think when it comes to governance, some of these things can be quite technical, things like general data protection regulations, for instance. There's various rules, there's various things you have to do. And I think because of the technical nature of these sorts of governance issues, rather than necessarily being the academic communities that should take the lead on promoting these things as they should in sort of virtues and integrity, I think this is very much the role of research support. And it's the reason why universities and other organizations have research and innovation services or whatever your research office is, which the idea is to have experts there who can sit alongside researchers and help them navigate the policies and processes that need to be followed when you're conducting research. So then the third part of the circle is what I'm calling ethics. And this is where I think the role of ethics committees is extremely important. And sometimes all of these issues are referred to as ethics. That's very much not the case. I think governance, as I said, that's a sort of very technical area. I think virtues and integrity, that needs to come from the research communities. But I think there is an important role of having independent committees looking at specific projects and considering, are participants in the projects, be they animals, be they humans, are they protected around the sort of nature of the project? And then secondly, are the researchers supported to be able to do the best research in this context? And certainly on the many ethics committees that I sit on, when you've sat on a lot of committees, you sort of get an idea of different approaches people can take to, say, recruiting participants, gaining consent, giving them participant information, those sorts of things. And you can actually help researchers build those projects as well. Now, there's various analyses people have done as to exactly how ethics committees should look at projects. One fairly helpful approach is this idea of principalism, borrowed from biomedical ethics, where an ethics committees sort of look at autonomy issues, so freedom of choice, freedom to participate in experiments, beneficence, the benefits, non-maleficence, the harm, and then sort of broader justice issues. And I think there's very much a role for these independent committees to look at specific research projects, specifically research protocols, and provide advice directly to those. As if we're talking about research culture, and if we want to build good research cultures, I think having these three different perspectives and understanding that there's these sorts of, these communities do overlap. I'm an academic who also works in our research innovation services and also chairs ethics committees. So I kind of do a little bit of all three of these, but I think these are three very good perspectives and important perspectives to understand that, if we want to address some of these problems around questionable research practices, some of these issues that Zoe was talking about, these sort of three different approaches, these three different angles can be really helpful to address these problems. So, just as an example, if you were to go and try and write a list of all the questionable research practices, going from the sorts of very honest sort of errors that people make errors in observation, analysis, inadequate record keep, these sorts of things that happen right the way through to the other end of the spectrum, legal research, misuse of funds, etc. And if you sort of put this kind of analysis on it, you can see that actually a lot of the things that fall down sort of this sort of end around the fraud, criminality, and misconduct, if you have really good policies and in some cases laws, you can actually prevent an awful lot of these sorts of things happening by taking a very sort of governance heavy approach. Things in the middle, when you're talking about sort of sloppiness and competence, if you have ethics committees that are actually looking at projects that researchers are proposing to do, they can maybe highlight where harking is one of my favourite's the right word, but hypothesizing after the results are known, where people sort of go on a fishing expedition and gather as much data as they possibly can and then analyze it in as many different ways as they can think of until they find something that they think is relevant and then publish that. That's a sort of fairly well-known questionable research practice, but that's actually something that ethics committees can be very sensitive to and can help, I think, spotting some of these things that happen in the middle of the spectrum. Obviously, integrity, how researchers behave is important right across the spectrum. Clearly, if you're behaving with honesty, you're less likely to do some of the things on this side of the spectrum, but likewise, you're going to be sort of more honest, I think, in realizing when you've made errors and in your approach to your experiment. So I think it can actually be quite helpful if you start thinking about the different questionable research practices in this different perspective. You can sort of see how you might be able to address these and how different members of the research community and research environment can contribute to stopping these sorts of things happening. So I'm going to finish my talk there with this model. I just find this from the perspective of someone who both is a researcher but also works at an institution trying to promote some positive research culture. I find it really helpful to just sort of break down my understanding of how we address these issues into what can be addressed through better governance processes, what can be addressed through the ethics committees and the role of the ethics committees, and then what is the sort of issues that the academic communities themselves need to take to really promote a culture of integrity and good practice in our research. So with that, I will hand back to James.
Simon, thank you very much. That was fascinating. It's really interesting to hear your perspective on research integrity. It's kind of components, parts, but also not in a theoretical way, in a very practical way as well, looking at how various actors within the system can do their bit to help progress things. It's fascinating. Thank you. Okay, so we've had some questions in the Q&A already, but please do keep them coming. Firstly, from T. Newman, how could study approvals be better embedded into the funding review process? The time to develop a study and secure all approvals is very hard to support prior to submission of grant applications, but arguably much funding is being wasted. Is there additional comment?
Yes, so I mean, from a researcher's perspective, the amount of administration you have to do around research is extremely frustrating. But you only have to be involved with 1 or 2 misconduct investigations, and you realize very rapidly why it's really important to have these policies and have these processes in place. And I think this very much falls within this sort of governance issue. Now, to a certain extent, I think there is always going to be bureaucracy. I think there's always going to be burning hoops, so to speak, that people have to jump through. But I think one of the most important things is try to make sure that when we're looking at processes, that we know and we understand very clearly why it is that each part of the process exists. And I think where often things start to go wrong is that rather than having one or a group of people having a good governance oversight as to how research is organized, it tends to be handled by different departments who don't talk to each other. So within a university, you might have a human resources department who deal with the contracts, and you might have a finance department who deals with some of the way the funding is, and then you might have a research and innovation services, or you might have a governance service, and they don't always talk and interact with each other particularly well. And one of the things I think is quite nice about this particular model is that if you can try and define what the governance elements are of the research process, then you can start to come up with some sort of network analysis, some sort of way of understanding how the different parts interact with each other and how you can create efficiencies around that. And it's important, I think, also to distinguish it from other players within the field. So ethics is a really good example. People think ethics committees are responsible for all sorts of things that they're not. And data protection being a really good example. Data protection is a very firm governance responsibility because it's the legal responsibility of the organization. People think it's the role of ethics committees, and there can be all sorts of confusions when, and I've had it before, I've had governance people say, oh, well, that's the ethics committee's responsibility. And the ethics committee say, no, that's not our responsibility, it's someone else. And then the poor researcher gets stuck in the middle and the whole thing gets really quite confusing. So I think trying to map out some of these interactions and trying to work out actually who's responsible for what is a really helpful way. I appreciate I answered that question in a sort of slightly more broader umbrella way. But I think certainly if anyone's involved in research administration, it's very important to try and understand these different perspectives.
Great. Thank you very much. Another question that popped up in the chat. Many initiatives regarding good research practice seem to be focused on the STEM disciplines in particular. How relevant are these issues to all academic disciplines, such as the arts and humanities, and what can we do to make sure that they are perceived to support researchers in those disciplines?
Absolutely, and a really good example there is around qualitative research. And I know a lot of qualitative researchers feel really quite hard done by when they go through ethics processes, because they say, you know, this is all built around a sort of quantitative model. And when you approach something using a grounded theory approach or some sort of phenomenological analysis, you know, it doesn't quite fit into the system. I will say, certainly over the last 10 years or so, I've seen research processes significantly improve when it comes to dealing with qualitative research and research that is not in STEM areas. And in fact, even though, yes, I do come from a STEM area, I'm in the School of Healthcare Professions, pretty much every research project I've run for the last 5 or 10 years has had both a quantitative element to it, but also a qualitative element, you know, be it questionnaires, be it doing interviews, surveys with people as well. And I think increasingly there is a blurring of boundaries between traditional quantitative research and qualitative research. And as people start working together in teams more frequently, there's a better understanding of the value that different research perspectives bring. So you look at some of the healthcare research we've been involved with, we've had people from our arts and humanities faculty who've come in and help us with the way information is displayed. We've had, I think we had some people from our technology faculty contribute to some of the modeling that was done around COVID. And I think there's an increasing understanding that research now is a very interdisciplinary area. And although a lot of these sort of systems and processes have come out of STEM subjects originally, people are doing a much better job at understanding how they apply to other areas. And in fact, in my university, we use exactly the same ethics review process across all 5 of our faculties. And we've specifically designed it in such a way that it's as applicable to people who are doing research in the arts and humanities as it is in the more traditional STEM subjects. So I think there's still a way to go, and one does have to appreciate the history as to where these processes came from originally. But I think people are very definitely getting more sensitive to these other research areas.
Thank you very much. A quick comment, someone says they totally agree with you about the number of different teams and departments you need to deal with to get various approvals, and sometimes the lack of cohesion between them. A question from Catherine regarding research ethics. How fast are research ethics regarding animals involved in research evolving as part of the current kind of ethical reflections of society at the moment about how we treat animals?
I mean, there's in some ways the ethics around animal research is a lot better developed than the ethics around human research. And I mean, there's animal welfare and experimental research bodies, or AWERBs, which are committees that all universities or other organizations that are doing animal research need to have, and that will include having independent vets and other experts as well. So I think that particular area, there's very strong governance, there's very strong ethics. And to be fair, most of the researchers I know who are involved in animal research are very sensitive to these areas. They have thought about it, and in some ways have thought about it far more than people who are involved in human participant research. So I think those of us who do work with humans can actually learn quite a lot from animal researchers, because if you look at the history that's happened around animal research, there's sort of some of the problems, the public conversations and dialogues, they've got their governance, integrity and ethics aspects sorted out in quite impressive ways when it comes to animal research. So I think they're actually quite a good model to follow when we're thinking about these things.
That's really interesting. Thank you very much. Lisa asks, how do institutions embed or at least foster a culture of research when there are competing priorities such as teaching and a continued lack of resources?
Yeah, and I mean, that's the million-dollar question. And it's not just for academics and researchers, it's sort of all aspects of society. When there's limited resources, how do you prioritize? I think one of the important things, though, is to not try to spread oneself too thinly. And I think sometimes institutions are guilty of trying almost to do too much research rather than doing a smaller amount really well and properly. And some areas that often get compromised on sort of sit in the governance sort of resource to have good governance. You know, if you're going to be doing human participant research, if you're going to be working, say, with the NHS, there's certain processes that you need to follow. Researchers need that governance support to go through those processes. And so if an institution wants to do research in those areas, they need to also fund the, say, governance support for people to do research in those technical areas. Likewise, training and mentoring, you need to invest in those sorts of areas. And I think if there are limited resources, it's important to make sure that you do a very good job of what it is you are doing, rather than trying to spread resources or staff too thinly.
Thank you. That's a really good point. Tony asks, if we want 100% of research projects end up with significant outputs, then this could lead to risk aversion and discourage academics from looking at more sort of speculative or original topics. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, that 85% research waste, it does need caveating. An awful lot of research, although it doesn't lead to, say, a publication, does lead to experience among researchers. Quite often you have to do 10 experiments, 9 of which don't work, and then you get that one experiment that does actually work. So there are sort of various caveats around that. But I think it's kind of sort of making the point that if we want research to be useful, it needs to have some sort of output. And quite often the incentives within the system push us not to publish good research results, but push us to get the next research grant. And it's like we publish to get grants rather than get grants to publish papers. And you can get things the wrong way around. So yes, I agree, we will never get to 100% of research projects publishing or coming up with something useful. Research is a difficult thing to do right. There's plenty of reasons why you never get to that point of publishing the research. But having said that, I think it is a little bit of, I think we do have to be very self-reflective when we are doing research and think, well, are we just doing this to try and tick some institutional box or try to just get the next research grant, or are we actually trying to do something that people will find helpful at the end of the day? And this, if we're involving human participants, it's a waste of our participants' time if the research that you're doing with them does not lead to some sort of output at the end. So I think we actually have a moral and an ethical obligation to ensure that when we are setting up research projects and running research projects, we sort of are focusing on what those outputs are going to be all along the time. Yes, we may not get to 100%, but I'm sure we can do better than 85%.
Brilliant, thank you. A question from an anonymous attendee who asked about what do you feel the challenges are for smaller institutions operating in this space? You don't have the resources of big ones to address these issues. They particularly note some issues regarding conflicts of interest might be a challenge for smaller institutions.
Yeah, I find sitting on an ethics committee within my university more challenging than being on either the NHS or the Ministry of Defence ethics committees, simply because I know all the researchers who are coming to my institution's ethics committee, whereas you have that sort of that distance when you're on national committees. But I think it gets down to that point of trying to work out what your strengths are and then really focus on doing a good job of the areas where you have strength. And if the institution is so small that it does not have the resources to put in place strong governance processes, for instance, I think that suggests that there are some areas of research that just shouldn't be touched by the institution, because if you can't have that technical support to meet various laws, policies, processes that are necessary for some areas of research, animal research being a good example, you know, if you can't put the governance in place for doing it, you shouldn't really be doing research in those areas. Likewise, if you can't get ethics committees together to review projects, or if that's sort of a major bottleneck in the system, I think you have to look at prioritizing which projects are done, because I think all three of these areas are really important. And if you are going to have a good research culture, you do need to address all of them. And you can't just sort of try to forget about one of them and yet still try to do research, because if you start doing that, that's where questionable research practice comes in. That's where you start having breakdowns of these sort of broader integrity issues. And when people are put under pressure, that's when you start getting the misbehavior, the sort of plagiarism, fabrication, all this, those sorts of things as well. So yes, playing to strengths and making sure that all these areas are addressed appropriately, I think, are really essential.
Thank you. That's really good to know. One final question before we hand over to the next speaker. Yasmin asks, what do you recommend to deal with unexpected ethical dilemmas which can crop up, say, when one's doing field work, in terms of perhaps the need to have speedy decisions made, but equally still respect ethics?
Yeah. So I think this is where, if you're looking at the design of ethics review processes, it's absolutely true that generally an ethics committee will review a project before it starts. But I think it's important to allow some sort of more informal interaction between the ethics committees and researchers as research is going along, so that they can get advice. And I mean, there are amendment processes. Sometimes those can take a very long time. But we have, and the European Union is actually has quite a good model for this, is that for a lot of projects, they insist that an ethics advisor is appointed to the project, which is someone that the researchers can come back to and interact with as things develop. And I'm the ethics advisor on a couple projects there. I think having more of interaction between ethics committees and researchers as research is going on can be very helpful. Now, it gets back to resources, it gets back to time as well. But I think it's definitely possible that a lot of people who sit on ethics committees do so because they're interested in research and because they're interested in ethics. And quite often they'd be very happy to help and provide advice as projects are going along as well, if they're asked and approached about that. So if you're in an institution worried about those sorts of things, but they go and have a chat to the ethics committee chair and talk to them about how they may be able to support beyond just that initial review, because there are plenty of people providing that sort of support.
Thank you. That's a really good point. And it's also worth remembering that if as a researcher you encounter an ethical issue or dilemma, this won't be the first time this has happened. Your ethics committee, other colleagues, mentors, managers will have encountered this sort of thing before. So whatever problem you come across, there'll be people who have a useful perspective they can impart. Simon, that was great talk. Thank you so much. And we'll hopefully get you back some more questions and discussion towards the end of the session.